Upscaling is coming to Star Citizen in a big way. DLSS, FSR and CIG's own TSR solutions are going to be in the game with 323. Now, it's still on the PTU, so what I want to do here is not look at the performance that this brings, but actually the visual quality difference between the three of them, because it is fairly significant. Now, we're going to look at 4K for people looking to squeeze as much out on the high end, but we're also going to look at 1080p to see what can you do if you've got a lower end GPU. So lots of exciting things. There is a clear winner, and then second place is a bit more debatable, but I think there is a good recommendation for second place. We'll get into that at the end. Here we are, starting with a 4K image on the left, native, and a native 1440p image on the right. And in the middle, we've got DLSS quality, which is 1440p upscaled to 4K. Now, as you look at them with the image paused, you might see that 1440p is noticeably blurrier, and that basically is what's going on. The quality difference between DLSS, which is upscaled from 1440p, and actual 1440p, I think is fairly obvious. You're much better off having upscaling on in this case. What's interesting, I think, about this image is that actually DLSS, and this isn't true of necessarily the other two, but DLSS is a potentially better image than just the native image. At 4K, there's these elements here where there's a bit of shimmering and things going on. And down here, if we zoom into this bit here, the hallway, there's elements where the DLSS image is actually more kind of stable and there's less artifacting going on than the native one. So there's a case for DLSS being the best quality image in the game, and we'll explore the other options as we go. But the reasoning for this might be that the native image, I think CIG potentially has some anti-aliasing going on, or something going on that basically means that for some reason it has these elements where it kind of flickers. You see under here as well, there's a bit more flickering going on with these lights than there is just on the DLSS image. You'll also see, just as a comparison, as you zoom right in on this bit of text right in the background here, that the 1440p image is obviously blurrier, and yeah, the 4K and DLSS quality version are much better. Next up, we've got the normal 4K native image versus DLSS quality versus DLSS balanced versus DLSS performance. Now, the easiest way to explain this is that the quality, as we said, is upscaled from 1440p, the performance is upscaled from 1080p, and the balance is in between, some sort of resolution in between those. So, looking at this image, what do you think? I think, as we zoom in here, that the DLSS performance has a noticeable kind of blurriness to it compared to definitely the quality. The balanced preset, as the video reloops, for all of them actually, all the different types as we look through them, has this weird bit of craziness going on here. So I'm not quite sure what that's about. But interestingly, again, looking at these kind of artifacting bits going on in the 4K native image, all versions of DLSS are potentially a kind of more stable version. If we zoom right in on that, these signs here, and potentially again, if we look at the lights flickering underneath, the DLSS image on all versions, all quality settings is better. You potentially might see again here as we come around the edges of this, whatever this globe craziness thing here on 4K, there's definite kind of, you can see things as it comes around on the edges of these shapes, whereas with the DLSS images, all of them are pretty much better, really. Now let's take a look at FSR. So this is AMD's version. The main difference is that obviously DLSS on NVIDIA cards is using actual dedicated hardware, whereas this is a software solution. That's why all GPUs can run this. But you will see immediately that this doesn't probably have the same level of quality as DLSS. So if we are to zoom in right again, we'll see a similar kind of image to the native 4K version, but with parts that kind of fall down. So again, on these edges of the shapes, it's not as sharp as DLSS was. And again, as we get to this sign, it's showing similar kind of characteristics as the native image, but I think as you scale down from quality to balance to performance, it potentially gets worse. You also have these these kind of light bits here, which are flickering, which aren't flickering on the native image. Again, this bit of this corner here, this kind of light spot here, flickers. I mean, one thing to maybe it's a positive, I don't think there is a noticeable kind of drop in sharpness between these settings in the same way that there is with DLSS. So I think the performance version doesn't really look as kind of smeary as the DLSS version does, but there's obviously other factors going on that make this not potentially as good as the DLSS image. Also, you've got this, compare this element here on the native image to the kind of flickering bits that are going on with FSR. Next up, we've got CIG's own TSR. So this, again, we've got the quality, balance and performance going from 1440p, somewhere in between, and then 1080p. And again, I think similar to FSR, the performance version doesn't lose much kind of sharpness to the image, but it's got similar issues to FSR. So again, the artifacting on these signs, these flickering elements here, the kind of lights that they're not as bad actually on TSR, I don't think, as FSR. This one here isn't really flickering too much, but some of these elements in the background are. And similar to FSR, there's points where the pixels here all just get a bit smushed up and messy. But I think, as we go on to compare them, I think actually TSR might be slightly better than FSR. And here is the big one, the comparison between DLSS quality, FSR quality, and TSR quality. So as you again look at the image, the things that we've already pointed out, the DLSS image holds up better with this sign here. Also, I think if you again get into this text in the background, you can see the kind of shimmering and movement on the other two. Again, as we pointed out, the difference in terms of these elements in the background, these lights, the DLSS image is the most stable, even more than native. The TSR one here actually is looking slightly worse than FSR, but there are points where, for instance, this bit of kind of light here is only shimmering on FSR compared to TSR. If we look at the actual logo for ArtCorp here, again, the DLSS image is potentially even sharper than the native one, but it's definitely better than the FSR and TSR. And I think I'd probably slightly give this to, if you look around these letters here, I think the TSR implementation is actually better than the FSR one. It's not as crazy. And also these lines at the top are better on TSR and the other two compared to FSR. Like I say, I think DLSS, even upscaled, is probably a better image than, in this scene at least, it's probably a better image than the actual native 4K image. And then one final test at 4K. This is now the performance versions of each upscaling. So this is the 1080p upscaled to 4K. So I think there's a case to say that the DLSS image is kind of the smeariest or the blurriest potentially, but there's still parts of the image where the DLSS implementation, even though maybe it's not quite sharp, is looking a lot better. Again, look at these edges here, look at the pixelation on the FSR and TSR versions versus the DLSS one. These shapes are holding up much better under DLSS. One use case for upscaling is to use lower end graphics cards and upscale from lower resolutions to 1080p. Now, there are fundamental problems with this. The lower the resolution, the less data you're giving these upscaling pieces of technology, and it can kind of fall down as you go lower and lower. So we'll explore that. This, first of all, is just a comparison between native 1080p versus DLSS quality and 720p. And so again, now DLSS quality is upscaling from 720p up to 1080p. Now, again, similar to things that we've seen before, there's parts of the image under DLSS where it's better than native, and you'll see just naturally more artifacting, I think, from the lower resolution here, 720p versus DLSS. So again, there's a case to say that DLSS is better than native even at lower resolutions, but I think this potentially is, again, less sharp maybe than the native options, which again you'd expect. But again, DLSS doing a good job with the overall image, and again the elements before that we saw, which are there's movement in, and there's parts where things are kind of falling down, are better in the DLSS option. Let's take a look at the different DLSS versions at 1080p. So we've got quality, which is again 720p upscaled to 1080p. We've got balanced, which is something like 626p upscaled to 1080p. And then performance, which is going as low as something like 540p. So we've really dropped the base resolution to upscale here. And I think it does show in parts. Again, the image, I think, gets kind of smeared more as you drop down to performance. It's really quite a low resolution to upscale to. There are still elements, I think, of this that DLSS is doing better, even on performance. Again, this sign is looking better than the native version. These lights in the background, there are parts where bizarrely, yeah, even when you're dropping as low as 540p, we're doing pretty well. Again, these shapes compared to the native image, I think they're probably better, again, even with performance mode. So it just shows, I think, the quality that DLSS has potentially. Again, for some reason, the balanced preset has this weirdness going on. I'm not really sure why, but yeah, actually quite impressive. The DLSS options, even at 1080p. Unfortunately, we can't really say the same for FSR. So again, quality, balance, performance. There are, I think, increasing numbers of kind of artifacting and flickering going on. So I think this under the globe thing gets worse as you drop down. I think again, unlike DLSS, the sharpness of the overall image seems to hold up. So that isn't really an issue. But again, there are other issues. So again, these signs, I think, and the lights, it's kind of gets worse as you go down. The shapes again here, there's all sorts of kind of pixelation craziness going on. TSR again, it's quite a similar image to FSR in some ways, but we're seeing really the same issues on the whole. Maybe not as bad. I do think from what I've seen here is that TSR does hold up better than FSR, but let's compare them all together and see what they look like compared. So now we've got DLSS quality, FSR quality, and TSR quality. So a way to actually compare them all at 1080p. And again, I think there's a case to say that there's just a level of blurriness to the DLSS image compared to the other two, but there's other issues, as we say. So the flickering under here is similar between FSR and TSR. What's actually noticeably worse on the FSR image is this kind of light element here. It's definitely it's worse on this compared to TSR and the other two. So again, I think FSR does come in third place, and this bit of light here is definitely worse on FSR compared to TSR. So again, it's another real. If you again look at this sign in the background, there's much more just movement going on in the other two upscaling versus DLSS and this sign. Although now you can't read this at this resolution, it's the movement and the artifacting is by far best in DLSS. So now we're looking at the lowest of the low, 540p upscaled to 1080p. So this really is targeted for people with very low end GPUs. And again, we're seeing the same things we've been seeing. The DLSS image is better, again, in some ways than the actual 1080p native image, although there's not as sharp, I would say. But the other two, yeah, the artifacting, just the lack of stability in the image, the pixels that are kind of just going all over the place here. There's big problems from an image quality point of view. And obviously image quality isn't necessarily the only factor. Performance, which we will obviously cover once this has gone live, I'll do that again. But again, look at this line down here. compared to the DLSS version, which is absolutely rock solid, we're in real trouble here on both FSR and TSR. So what do we make of all this? Well, this is only one scene that we're looking at, but there's visuals going on, movement, static bits, lots of things to look at, and it's clear that DLSS is fairly far ahead of the other two, and kind of better than even the native image that you get from Star Citizen. This isn't completely shocking. Like, if you're aware of this situation with DLSS and FSR, there's general acceptance that DLSS is fairly far ahead, and it's obviously using actual hardware on the GPUs, the Tensor cores, versus AMD's solution, which is a software solution. So it isn't shocking, but really it's quite impressive how well the NVIDIA solution works. And really, if you've got a card that is DLSS capable, then that's the clear choice. But what about the other two? So say you've got an older NVIDIA card or an AMD card or an Intel card. Well, I think TSR is actually better than FSR. So I've had a few comments saying, why are CIG bothering to do this? Why are they implementing their own solution? And I think the reality is it's because they've done a better job than AMD. So they've provided a solution that is, in parts, it's not completely miles ahead, but there are moments where it's actually a better image than FSR. So fair play to CIG. I mean, I'm assuming this will have taken a fair amount of work to do this, but for people who aren't able to use DLSS, they've provided the next best solution. So it's definitely DLSS in first place, TSR in second place, and then FSR. I don't know why you would choose that over TSR, really. The other factor, obviously, is which mode you would choose. And we did see that, especially on the DLSS side, actually, as you drop from quality to balanced to performance, you do lose sharpness, potentially, although the DLSS, the rest of the image holds up pretty well. So this really will be a trial and error thing that I'll follow up when we look at actual performance once 323 has gone live, because there's no point dropping all the way down to, say, something like balanced or performance if your CPU is bottlenecking you. You're just losing image quality. So I will do a proper deep dive into the upscaling from the performance side once this goes live. But for now, I'm fairly impressed with DLSS, and often people will say to me, there'll be comments that will say, why aren't you testing more AMD cards or things like that, or same with the CPUs. And I genuinely have no preference between any of the different hardware manufacturers. I would recommend an AMD CPU right now, and I think based on this, you would probably recommend people looking to buy things. You'd probably recommend a DLSS capable GPU, so an NVIDIA GPU. So yeah, there is no bias, and I don't think anybody who's got an AMD card needs to go out and panic. AMD 100% will improve their technology. Whether they'll eventually move to a hardware solution like NVIDIA as well, I don't know. But I'm sure they'll get better. I'm sure CIG's solution will get better. But yeah, for now, there is a plus point for NVIDIA cards. And obviously they come with a price premium. But in this case, you can actually see a visual improvement with DLSS. So you've got to weigh all these things up when you're buying GPUs. And again, when we get the next generations of cards, the 5000 series or whatever we'll get from NVIDIA, and then AMD side, again, there'll be new bits of technology, there'll be improvements to things like this, and we can look at it all again. But right now, it's DLSS, then TSR, and then FSR.